Imagine watching a smug HOA president illegally build a $300,000 luxury pool on your family's ranch, knowing you hold the exact legal loophole to legally steal it from him. That is exactly what I did. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the financial revenge I took on this bully is an absolute masterpiece, and you are not going to miss how it ends. Imagine looking out the window of a ranch that has been in your family for 3 generations, a place built on sweat, blood, and calloused hands. Now, imagine seeing a man in a crisp polo shirt and a neon safety vest casually pounding wooden stakes into your prized pasture. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He was Richard, the president of the newly developed, ultra-wealthy Homeowners Association that had just metastasized on the border of my property, and he was about to make the biggest, most expensive mistake of his life. I didn't yell. I didn't call the cops. I just took a sip of my coffee and smiled. Because Richard didn't just cross a property line that morning. He crossed a man who had the original 1920 topographic maps, a tractor, and absolutely nothing to lose. But to understand how we got to the point of a $75,000 legal meltdown, you need to understand exactly what was happening on the border of my ranch. 6 months prior, a luxury developer bought the 50 acres east of my property. Almost overnight, my quiet mornings were replaced by the roar of bulldozers, the hammering of nail guns, and the rapid construction of identical sterile McMansions. I didn't care. I minded my business. I stayed on my side of the fence. But HOA boards? They don't know how to mind their business. It started with letters, passive-aggressive notices stuffed into my mailbox, complete with official-looking letterheads. They complained about the smell of my livestock. They complained about the color of my barn. They even had the audacity to cite me for having unapproved agricultural vehicles visible from their brand-new, private cul-de-sac. My property wasn't in their HOA. I wasn't bound by their ridiculous bylaws. I threw the letters in the wood stove and let them burn. But Richard couldn't handle being ignored. If he couldn't control my land through paperwork, he was going to control it by force. That brings us back to that Tuesday morning. I walked out of my front door, my boots crunching against the gravel, and made my way down to the eastern pasture. Richard was standing there with a clipboard, directing 2 contractors who were offloading massive rolls of chain link and privacy fencing. "Morning, Richard," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "You're a solid 50 feet onto my property." Richard didn't even look up from his clipboard. He just flashed this smug, entitled grin, the kind of smile worn by a man who has never been punched in the mouth. Actually, Richard sneered, tapping his pen against a freshly driven wooden stake. "Our surveyor was out here yesterday. According to the county GIS map, the HOA's property line extends right to this ridge. We're building the new community pool right here. So, you'll need to move your horses back. Today." My heart hammered against my ribs. He wasn't just building a fence. He was trying to annex a 1/4 acre of my prime grazing land to build a country club pool for his snob neighbors. I looked at the wooden stake. I looked at his contractors, who suddenly seemed very uncomfortable. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have immediately called a lawyer and spent thousands of dollars trying to file an injunction. But I knew something Richard didn't. I knew that the county GIS maps were notoriously inaccurate out here in the county. More importantly, I knew exactly where my great-grandfather had buried the original cast-iron property marker back in 1922. It was buried 3 feet deep, anchored in a block of concrete, right under where Richard was currently standing. "Suit yourself, Richard," I said, turning my back on him and walking away. He laughed, loudly, thinking he had won. He thought I was backing down. He thought I was just a dumb cowboy getting bullied into submission by a powerful HOA. But as I walked back to my barn, a terrifyingly calm, brilliantly wicked plan began to form in my mind. Richard wanted to rely on visual markers? Fine. He didn't know I owned a backhoe, and he definitely didn't know what I was about to do with it at 2 a.m. that night. The air was pitch black and dead silent, broken only by the low, predatory rumble of my John Deere backhoe firing up. It was 2 a.m., while the residents of the brand-new luxury HOA were fast asleep in their high-thread count sheets. I was out in the freezing pasture, shifting gears and lowering the hydraulic bucket. I wasn't out there to destroy Richard's wooden survey stakes. That would be vandalism. I was out there to set a trap made of dirt, iron, and pure, unfiltered HOA hubris. First, I had to uncover the truth. I parked the tractor and grabbed a shovel and a metal detector, sweeping the ground exactly where my grandfather's old journal said the marker would be. Beep, beep, beep. I started digging. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something hard. There it was, a heavy, rust-covered cast iron obelisk stamped with the year 1922, the absolute, undeniable, legally binding corner of my ranch. And it proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that Richard's little wooden stakes were exactly 54 feet onto my private property. Most people would have called the sheriff right then and there. They would have dragged Richard out of his bed, showed the deputies the iron marker, and forced the HOA to retreat. But you don't teach an arrogant bully a lesson by just pushing him back. You teach a bully a lesson by stepping out of his way, letting him swing so hard he completely destroys his own balance. So, I did the unthinkable. I moved my property line marker, not the legal cast iron one buried deep in the dirt, moving that would be a federal offense. I moved the visual one. For decades, my family had maintained a weathered, split-rail wooden fence that sat about 10 feet inside our actual property line just to keep the cattle away from the steep ridge. Under the cover of darkness, I hooked chains to those old wooden posts. I tore my own fence down, and I moved it 30 feet backward, deeper into my own land. I smoothed over the tractor tracks. I threw some loose hay over the freshly turned dirt. I was deliberately giving Richard the illusion of more land. I was handing him a fake green light. By 4:30 a.m., the new, retreated boundary made it look like Richard's wildly inaccurate survey stakes were entirely correct. I parked the backhoe in the barn, washed the grease off my hands, and went to sleep with the terrifyingly calm smile of a madman. At 7 a.m., the sun came up, and so did the HOA's massive fleet of construction trucks. I stood on my porch with a steaming mug of black coffee, watching the cavalry arrive. Cement mixers, trench diggers, pallets of high-end stone. Richard was standing right in the middle of it all, wearing a pristine white hard hat. He looked out toward my pasture, freezing when he noticed my fence had been moved back in the middle of the night. A massive, arrogant grin spread across his face. He puffed out his chest. He genuinely thought I was terrified. He thought his little clipboard and his threats of HOA litigation had bullied the dumb cowboy into surrendering his land. He looked right at me across the pasture and gave a mocking, victorious little wave. I didn't scowl. I didn't shout. I just tipped my hat to him. Go ahead, Richard. Dig. For the next 3 weeks, I had a front row seat to a masterpiece of financial ruin. I sat on my porch every single afternoon and watched them build. They excavated a massive 10-foot deep crater. They laid miles of steel rebar. They poured thousands of gallons of permanent, incredibly expensive concrete for the HOA's new crown jewel, a luxury Olympic-sized swimming pool, complete with a cascading stone waterfall and a heavy masonry privacy wall. It was beautiful, and it was costing the HOA board hundreds of thousands of dollars. The entire community was buzzing with excitement, completely unaware of the ticking time bomb buried beneath their shiny new country club. They poured the money. They poured the concrete. But they missed one crucial, devastating detail. What Richard didn't know was that I had a meeting scheduled with the county property appraiser, and I had a very specific, heavily stamped legal document sitting on my kitchen counter. Because Richard wasn't just building a $250,000 pool on my land, he was triggering a ruthless little county ordinance regarding fixed permanent structures, an ordinance that was about to legally transfer ownership of that entire luxury pool directly to me. The water in the new HOA pool was a pristine, sparkling blue. It looked absolutely gorgeous, shimmering in the summer sun, especially since it was sitting exactly 54 feet inside my property line. The construction crews had finally packed up their heavy machinery, leaving behind a $300,000 masonry masterpiece. But the real show, the one I had been patiently waiting for, was just about to begin. Richard, our esteemed HOA president, was practically vibrating with pride. He strutted around the concrete deck in his tailored khakis, hanging up metal private property, HOA members only signs on the gates. I could hear the clinking of champagne glasses from my porch as the board members celebrated their stolen victory. They had absolutely no idea they were toasting their own financial funeral. Down at the county courthouse, I had been busy doing some digging of my own. I wasn't looking for dirt. I was looking for impenetrable case law. In our state, the laws regarding HOA encroachment are notoriously brutal, especially when it comes to permanent, fixed structures. If someone builds on your land without permission, you have two distinct legal options. You can file an injunction and force them to demolish it at their own expense. Or, thanks to a very specific, obscure county ordinance regarding structural annexation, you can legally claim it as your own. I didn't want to destroy their beautiful new country club. I just wanted to be the sole owner of it. The grand opening of the pool was officially scheduled for Saturday at noon. By Friday morning, it was time to drop the hammer. I didn't walk down to the property line alone that day. I brought a special guest. He was a highly credentialed state-licensed surveyor I had hired out of pocket to perform a legally binding boundary verification. He wasn't relying on a shoddy, outdated county GIS map like Richard's guys did. He was relying on the magnetic pull of a 1922 cast-iron obelisk buried deep in the earth. Richard was busy arranging luxury patio furniture when we crossed the grass. He immediately puffed out his chest, his face turning a dangerous, indignant shade of red. "Hey, you can't be here. This is private HOA property," he barked, marching toward us with a scowl. My surveyor didn't even look at him. The surveyor just kept walking, his equipment beeping in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. He walked right past Richard's flailing arms. He walked right past the shiny new no trespassing signs. And he walked straight to the edge of the brand new, heavily insured concrete pool deck. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with sudden panic. He whipped out his phone, aggressively threatening to call the sheriff and have us arrested. I just smiled, didn't say a word, and pointed directly at the concrete beneath his feet. The surveyor's metal detector was screaming a high-pitched wail, registering the massive iron marker hidden just beneath the soil. The surveyor reached into his bag and pulled out a massive can of neon orange spray paint. With a quick, practiced flick of his wrist, he painted a bright, glowing X right on the edge of their pristine concrete deck. Then he drew a thick orange line cutting directly across the expensive stone patio. The neon paint sliced straight through the water, climbed up the cascading waterfall, and ended at the masonry privacy wall. Richard froze, his cell phone hovering uselessly in the air. The color completely drained from his face as the orange paint dried in the hot morning sun. "That," the surveyor said calmly, pointing his pen to the glowing line, "is the legally verified boundary of this ranch." The visual math was undeniable, and it was utterly devastating. The pool, the luxury deck, the stone waterfall, and the brand new pump house were all sitting squarely on my side of that orange line. Richard started stammering, his eyes darting frantically as he pointed a trembling finger at the wooden fence I had moved weeks ago. "But the fence, your fence is way back there." I reached into my denim jacket and pulled out a heavily folded document. It wasn't a friendly warning, and it wasn't a request for a neighborhood mediation. It was a legally binding notice of encroachment and absolute ownership stamped in red ink by the county clerk. I handed it to Richard, watching his hands shake as his eyes landed on the bold black lettering of the title. He was about to realize that his $300,000 HOA pool didn't belong to the neighborhood anymore. But the twist I had prepared for him in that envelope was far worse than simply losing the pool. Richard stood completely frozen on the neon-striped concrete, staring at the notice of encroachment. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the page. He wasn't just reading a standard legal document. He was reading his own financial obituary. The paper in his trembling hands outlined the brutal, undeniable reality of fixture law. In our state, when a permanent structure is anchored deep into the earth, it legally becomes part of the land itself. You can't just unpour a foundation. You can't just repo a massive hole in the ground. By building on my legally verified property, the HOA hadn't just made an arrogant mistake. They had essentially gifted me a $250,000 luxury pool entirely free of charge. But that wasn't the twist that made Richard's knees buckle. The real devastation was waiting for him on page 2. I nodded, gesturing for him to flip the page. He swallowed hard, turning to the second sheet. It was a heavily itemized invoice. Because my ranch was strictly zoned for agricultural use, unpermitted commercial construction carried severe, mandatory daily penalties. But I wasn't the county. I was a private landowner, and I was legally entitled to charge a daily unauthorized land use and storage fee. I had backdated the invoice to the exact day his bulldozers first crossed my property line. The total was already sitting at $42,000, and it was accruing at a staggering $1,500 every single day. You can't do this. Richard gasped, his voice barely a hollow whisper. The arrogant, chest-puffing bully was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, sweating middle manager realizing he had just bankrupted his own wealthy community. Actually, Richard, I replied, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee. And if this invoice isn't paid in full within 30 days, I'll put a mechanic's lien on the HOA's master insurance policy. You won't be able to sell a single house in this entire neighborhood. He snapped. The sheer panic abruptly morphed into a desperate, rabid fury. He crumpled the legal notice and threw it onto the deck. "We'll rip it out," he screamed, his face turning a vibrant shade of purple. "I'll have the excavators back here tomorrow morning. We will tear this whole pool out of the ground before we pay you a single dime." I smiled. That was exactly what I was hoping he would say. I reached into my denim jacket, pulled out my phone, and tapped on a specific app. "If you send a single piece of heavy machinery across that orange line, Richard, it's no longer a civil dispute," I explained with a terrifying calm. "That pool is legally my property now. If you scratch the tile, if you crack the concrete, it's a Class 4 felony for criminal destruction of private property." I pointed a finger up toward my barn. Mounted directly under the eaves were 3 brand-new high-definition security cameras installed the night before. They were pointed straight at the pool. "If you or your contractors touch my new country club, I will have you arrested for felony vandalism before lunch." Checkmate. He couldn't use the pool. He couldn't tear the pool down. And every 24 hours he spent trying to figure a way out, the HOA owed me another $1,500. Richard stumbled backward, looking physically ill. The highly anticipated grand opening for the community was less than 24 hours away. The entire neighborhood was planning on showing up with their kids, their towels, and their coolers. Instead, they were going to be greeted by my new barbed wire fence and a $42,000 bill. Word spread through the luxury subdivision like wildfire. Within 3 hours, my phone started ringing off the hook. It wasn't Richard. It was the expensive, shark suit lawyers retained by the HOA board threatening fire and brimstone. They demanded an emergency mediation meeting at the county courthouse for the very next morning. They thought they could easily intimidate me with a table full of sharp suits and aggressive legal jargon. They assumed I was just a stubborn rancher who got lucky with a surveyor. I agreed to the meeting without hesitation, because in their blind, panicked rush to silence me, the lawyers had just made a catastrophic, unrecoverable error. When they filed that emergency injunction, they were legally forced to submit the HOA's foundational charter into the public court record. They exposed their entire financial playbook. And when I spent that night reading through their bylaws, I found a single, terrifying clause hidden on page 47. A clause that meant the HOA wasn't going to pay for this 6-figure mistake. Richard was. The mahogany table in conference room B was so heavily polished it practically reflected Richard's sheer, unadulterated terror. It was 9 a.m. on Saturday. The emergency mediation was in full swing. We were exactly 3 hours away from the grand opening of the luxury pool, and the HOA's legal team had come out swinging. 3 men in $1,000 suits sat across from me, flanking Richard like heavily armed bodyguards. They slammed a massive stack of paper onto the table, threatening me with everything from adverse possession claims to good faith encroachment defenses. They aggressively demanded I sign a quitclaim deed, surrendering my land to the HOA for a measly $10,000 settlement. If I refused, they promised to drag me through civil court for a decade until my legal fees bankrupted the ranch. They were loud. They were intimidating. They were completely and utterly firing blanks. I let the lead attorney finish his chest-beating monologue. I didn't interrupt. I just sat back in my chair, took a slow sip of the terrible courthouse coffee, and smiled. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The attorney narrowed his eyes, adjusting his silk tie. "We are offering you a very generous way out of a very expensive lawsuit. I suggest you take it." "I don't need a way out," I replied calmly. "Because you're threatening the wrong person." I reached into my battered leather briefcase and pulled out a single, heavily highlighted document. It wasn't a state statute. It wasn't a county ordinance. It was a printed copy of the HOA's very own foundational bylaws, specifically the covenants, conditions, and restrictions the CC and RS. I slid the paper across the polished mahogany. I watched it glide until it stopped perfectly in front of the lead attorney. Page 47, Section 8, Paragraph 4, I instructed. The room went dead silent. The attorney looked down at the highlighted text. As his eyes scanned the legal jargon, the aggressive, arrogant posture completely drained from his body. He stopped breathing for a solid 5 seconds. That specific clause outlined the strict limitations of the HOA's directors and officers' liability insurance. It stated that the neighborhood's master policy covered the board for accidental mistakes and administrative errors. But there was a massive, uncrossable line drawn in the sand. The insurance immediately voided itself in cases of gross, willful, and undocumented negligence. When Richard ordered the excavation of my property, I explained, leaning forward, he deliberately bypassed the mandatory commercial boundary survey to save the HOA $3,000. He ordered his contractors to rely on outdated, non-binding county GIS maps. That isn't an accident. I locked eyes with Richard. He looked like he was going to be sick. That is gross, willful negligence, I continued softly, which means the HOA's insurance policy is entirely void. The neighborhood isn't liable for this $300,000 mistake. The neighborhood doesn't owe me $42,000 in trespass fines. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Because of that single clause, Richard was stripped of his corporate protection. He was entirely personally liable for every single penny of the disaster he had created. If I forced the demolition of the pool, the cost was coming directly out of Richard's personal bank accounts. If I kept the pool and enforced the daily fines, it was coming out of his retirement fund. The lead attorney slowly closed his folder. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Richard, his expression turning cold and clinical. Richard, the attorney said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. As of this exact moment, we no longer represent you. We represent the Homeowners Association, and we are advising the board to immediately pursue you for full restitution. They threw him under the bus without a second thought. The arrogant bully who had tried to steal my family's land was suddenly an island, completely abandoned by the very organization he thought made him invincible. The aftermath was glorious, and it was entirely on my terms. To save himself from absolute financial ruin and felony vandalism charges, Richard had to personally buy that tiny slice of my pasture. But he didn't get it for market value. He paid an extortionate, eye-watering 500% premium for the land, completely wiping out his personal savings just to give the HOA their pool back. He resigned from the board in disgrace that very afternoon. 3 weeks later, a for sale sign quietly appeared on his pristine front lawn. The HOA got their pool. I got a massive 6-figure payout. And as I sat on my porch, watching the sunset over my newly funded, permanently protected ranch, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the best way to deal with a bully isn't to build a taller fence. It's to let them build one for you and charge them for the privilege.